Mr. Ajay Dua, former Commerce Secretary, is joining us on the broadcast to talk more about this. Mr. Dua, appreciate you taking out the time and speaking with us, sir. Well, initially there seemed to be some reluctance or apprehension about these reciprocal tariffs that were being, let's say, threatened towards India. But now perhaps there is a silver lining to these tariffs as well. India could be, getting a newer share of the American market.
Thank you for having me, Vineet. I'm not sure whether the trade agreement, which you just talked about, can be put in position before the deadline of April 2nd. That's when President Trump's administration is due to levy the reciprocal taxes or the reciprocal duties. If we are able to convince the team from the Trade Department of the United States, which is in India since yesterday, that we mean to come to an understanding, call it an early harvest as we call it usually in trade, that at least a partial trade agreement could be arrived at quickly. Maybe that could persuade the United States administration not to levy the reciprocal duty, which has been threatened to be imposed on almost all countries with which the United States has a trade deficit, and as we know, there are quite a few of them.
So, what do you think that the Americans will stand to gain in this relationship? And if India does concede to these tariffs, what do you think is going to be the long-term impact, not only in terms of trade, but also in terms of accommodating American whims and fancies?
I would think that the biggest gain to the United States, if it arrives at an understanding, even if it's a partial one, not covering all the items, would be that it would have diversified its source of procurement. The huge dependence upon the Chinese, good as it might be, the Chinese might be more competitive than us, but at the same time, the United States remains vulnerable to the whims and fancies and the state of the geopolitical status vis-a-vis China. By continuing to have a trade relationship and growing it with India, provided, of course, the United States is convinced that we are on the right track. Yes, we may have been a very high, we may have protected ourselves for too long under a shield of tariffs and non-tariff barriers, and our average tariff is certainly almost 3 times the 3.5 of the United States, and we are close to 10 tariffs. The fact is that opening up of the trade without the tariff protection is good for India. In the long term, we will become more competitive.
Mr. Dua, also important to understand that India is a growing economy, and we obviously have aspirations, to rival China at some point in time. Do you think this move is going to be helpful in that direction?
I should think so, but at the same time, Vineet, let's not overplay the long-term role of tariff protection. Infant industry argument, yes, we've tried it for 70 years. Right from the 50s or the 60s, we brought in saying that our imports have to be, our production has to be protected. And you've seen that after 1991, when we so-called opened it up to a greater trade, that our export hasn't shot up. If anything, the exports have only gradually increased, which means that we have to do the introspection, which I think the move by the United States is forcing many countries, including India, to undertake. In the long run, I think that would stand us in good stead rather than continuing to follow a well tried out policy for all these years, which has had its adverse implications on the growth of the Indian economy, particularly by way of greater bilateral trade and multilateral trade.
Mr. Dua, always a pleasure having you, sir. Thank you so much for being here.